Welcome to episode number 7 of Stir Crazy on the Real News Network. Today we're asking the question, is capitalism a virus? With our hosts Marcus Ferrell, Jocelyn Keatts, Steve Horn, and myself, Charles Lenchner. This is the Real News Network's latest show, and we love your feedback. Let us know you're here and what's on your mind today. Are we helping you survive another day in isolation? Today we're going to start off with this top story for us. It looks like this will not shock everyone listening that while the coronavirus and the disease COVID-19 is affecting Americans in every sector, every background, every state, surprise, surprise, it seems to be more lethal to African Americans than to anyone else. Marcus, you're qualified to answer this question. Why is it most lethal to African Americans compared to everybody else? Some of the people listening may need more elaboration on this topic, and I'm going to try and be specific. Like,
all right, okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
African Americans are the least insured, especially African American men. African American people in general are the most least insured folks in America. We have the highest rates of infant mortality, hypertension, and also the smallest amount of doctor visits, right? So if you put that all together, also with a systematic racism in the South and some of our local governments, what you will find is that when America gets a cold, African Americans get the flu. If you look along the 1940s redlining areas, and if you don't know what redlining is, we could probably provide a link. But if you notice something, and most of the historically impacted areas of redlining, and one of the most historically impacted areas of over policing, is also now one of the largest places where folks are getting COVID-19. So if you don't add, if you don't decide to add institutional racism, and what I mean by that is the implementation of lack of access, lack of health care. People who don't have health care here in Fulton County are sent home with a hope and a dream. I live in Fulton County, Atlanta, Georgia. This is one of the blackest counties in America, and also one of the highest ratio of COVID-19 here in Georgia. So I'm going to point at institutional racism, and that's a factual thing.
So one of the things that we could expect right now is that a politician, maybe a president, would say, in full recognition that the African American community and probably a few others, as we'll see in just a bit, are suffering disproportionately, they might come out with policies to address this that disproportionately help those who are most suffering. What would those measures, do you have any idea what measures could be done that somehow leave our capitalist healthcare hellscape intact?
Well, I want to say this right here. If we talk about what's going on in the prisons right now, where African Americans are out proportionately people who are populating prisons, right? Brown and black people are the main ones. Yet these prison systems, these private prison systems, are literally ground zero in some cases for the amount of COVID-19 cases, and people are getting released. People are asymptomatic and they don't have any symptoms, but they've been in jail for a while. So I'll tell you one way to start, and we're probably going to go into that, and that's criminal justice reform. Another thing is also, I hate to be like this, but we've said this on this channel multiple times, and that's Medicare for all, right? It'll be a lot easier for an African-American person who doesn't have insurance to not have to spend $400 right now. And if you think about it, the Congress gave us $1,200. If you got a gold standard with a family of four for $400, that's what it costs under the ACA to get health care. Now that leaves you with how much money if you just lost your job? That leaves you with $800 to take care of your family until they decide to go ahead and give you more money. Now, that's going to affect African-American communities, especially folks who used to be employed and now aren't employed. And I know plenty of people who are African-American right now, Latino, that are unemployed right now, just like the rest of America. But anything that happens to our community, us as general always happens to the African American community 10 times fold. And we need more policy. So Medicare for all, that would help. Opening up some of these hospitals, letting some folks out of jail and out of prison right now so they can go get tested. And more importantly, a little bit of money about community education in places where they're not putting resources in.
Fair enough. Thank you, Marcus. Steve, you have an update to this story for us.
Well, yeah, there's a related one, and there's also just the subject of how do we even know who this is impacting? And the truth is, the story that our conversation is based around is in Milwaukee, where they collect data on race, both at the city level and the county level. Therefore, we know that there is great racial inequity in who is both getting sick and dying from COVID-19 in Milwaukee, which is the biggest city in Wisconsin. But at the national level, the CDC has chosen not to collect data. So all we know is the location. So it's up to, there are some states that are collecting this data, but mostly we only know broadly where it's happening, not who it's happening to. And I think that obviously it would be very important to get this data to know how to react to it in the future, to learn things about, healthcare coverage, who's going to get universal health care. I mean, hopefully everyone I guess by definition everyone does, but sort of the responses to things like this, if we don't have this data, how do we know how to respond in the future to pandemics and other public health crises? And that gets to a related story, and that is, it's not just African-American people who are finding these inequities, it's also Native American communities. And also, it's not just who's contracting the illness potentially, but the economic ramifications of this, because as the Washington Post recently reported, the casinos, which have all closed down due to the government mandate, basically that means that the economic engines of tribes across the country are being hammered right now. And of course, like that's the case with small business throughout America, but this is the main epicenter of business on tribes. And the way that it was described in the Washington Post article is it's akin to like a county government or a state government just shutting down the entire engine for these tribes. And like Marcus was saying, the people on these tribes often live in closer quarters. This is putting elderly members of the tribe greatly at risk. And then on top of that, within the Native American community, for those who've spent time reporting on it, for example, I have reporting on the Keystone XL and Dakota Access fights, there is great reverence towards the elderly and respecting the elderly and the traditions, carrying on the traditions. So this is very hard culturally for Native American communities, and that you have to kind of maintain a distance to keep the elderly safe. So there's just a lot of hardships right now that are facing Native American communities in America.
It's a moment to think about the fact that while we expect our leaders and the president to treat this as a national emergency that affects everyone, we should also expect our leaders not to treat it like it affects everyone in the same way. And I'm reminded of conversations about how politicians talk to constituents on the campaign trail, comparisons of, say, Elizabeth Warren versus Bernie Sanders. And it's a moment where you can really see the failure of talking to different communities at eye level about what they're experiencing and the negative impact that has. Well, we'll be here if that changes, but because we live in a terrible country, it won't. Moving on now to the broader question of politics, American politics in the wake of the virus. We have a lot of folks sort of contemplating what it means for this country going forward with politics in the wake of the pandemic. And I wanted to start this time with Steve and ask you about what changes can we look forward to? Which changes should we be fearing?
Well, I think that the already alarming sign that we've seen through these debates, if you'll call them that, in the stimulus packages is that Democrats aren't really putting up much of a real fight substantively on really getting things through for working class and poor people, people of color in this country. Of course, there was the unemployment compensation for several months, but compare that to how much money was given to Wall Street, compare that to how much money was given to corporations, consider the loopholes. For example, the Wall Street Journal reported today that within the small business package, chains are underneath that banner. So like McDonald's could be underneath, Taco Bell, these major corporations that have franchises, those are considered small businesses and could be eligible for those grants. So when you really look into the details of what was passed in this $2.1 trillion package, I think it does raise serious questions on like how hard are Democrats really fighting for a just package. And there's already a new fight. And I think that the article The Intercept wrote recently about this was they kind of looked at what will happen in 2021, or sort of the electoral campaigns for both parties, and like what will be the outcome. Will we see right-wing populism, or will we see sort of a progressive future? And unless there's an actual progressive platform that is fought for in real substantive ways in the coming months within Congress, which is reacting to this on a day-to-day basis, although they're on recess now, they'll be back in session later this month. Unless that happens, I think that the whole premise of the article is sort of like looking to the future. Well, I think the present right now we're seeing is it has been inadequate for what the moment calls for. And the thing that I follow, the last thing I'll say for now, is look at the notion of a green stimulus. It was something that the climate movement was pushing for, which admittedly is not the strongest force in politics, although it's growing. There was zero in the stimulus bill that was called for within the green stimulus besides money for public transit. So I'll be curious to see if, using that as one case study, will that be in the next stimulus package that will be up for discussion later in April when Pelosi and Schumer and the Republicans come back into town in Washington.
You know, I believe one thing about what's happening in Congress right now, and this might not be the thing that happens at this very moment, because we're just slowly sort of easing in our way, even though we've seen a lot of deaths. The average American has not seen the economic repercussions just yet of staying at home and not having enough money to pay your bills, or not having enough money to actually take care of yourself. In November, you have to ask yourself, is Congress going to get it right in November? And what I mean by that is $1,200 enough for you to take care of your family one time, right? Because once they figure out one major thing that families in America, because of capitalism and greed and how much it costs to pay rent downtown in any city, how much it costs to feed your family in some of these places. Once they figure out that this is not enough money, will they get it right in April to go up from $2,000 to $3,000 per month? Will there be a version of a universal basic income? Will there be a version of a Medicare for all? And understand this, Donald Trump, he's looking at this. And if he's down in the polls at all, understand something. Democrats in the centrists can be outflanked from the left by a guy like Donald Trump in a heartbeat. And what he might do is just say, well, you know what? I'm down 5 points in the poll. Let me do something real quick. Let me go ahead and give Americans $30,000 from now until November. Let me go ahead and open up the hospitals. And I don't think he will do that because he's so attached to capitalism, but he's crazy enough to do it. So we have to be aware of where we are positioning ourselves politically, and will the eat the rich mentality actually happen from folks midsummer when we start seeing real amounts of death and economic downfalls?
I believe that the President Trump would be perfectly fine with an eat the rich policy as long as it was only Democratic rich people. Jocelyn?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. That's why right-wing populism is so dangerous, because it's a wild card and it's a cultural catch-all, and it appeals to a large number of very engaged, very stupid people. Are you allowed to call people stupid on this show? No? Okay.
We do often.
And that's unfortunate, because a lot of the time, the people who are most energetic politically are not the people you want to be most energetic politically. And at the end of the day, the Democratic establishment has shown itself to be a poor operator in this regard time and time and again, because I'm not going to go so far as to say there was a conspiracy to stop Bernie Sanders, but I think it's pretty clear to say that they have not only underestimated the candidate Bernie Sanders, but what he is tapping into in the American psyche. And COVID-19, for all its horrors, structural, personal, all of it, could be an opportunity for us to mobilize in a serious way. And I think there's no doubt that that opportunity is not getting used.
Well, I think about how the passion for civility and the discourse around politics, which was deployed to silence Bernie Sanders and some of his supporters,
yes.
if the Democratic side actually sticks to that, they're basically going to be handing Trump and the Republicans one of their best weapons, which is a full-throated anger, rage, but it'll be directed not against the real causes of the crisis, but against the left.
Right. And that's the problem. If you have, when people are inherently emotional creatures in an emotional time, and Trump is tapping into that. He's doing a terrible job, and his approval ratings are still better than they've ever been. And if we're not going to learn a political lesson from that now, I'm concerned that we're missing a serious opportunity with that. So we'll just have to see what happens.
Right. Well, moving on now to our next story. I'm now looking at an In These Times feature from last week, asking the question: is building missiles essential? And it's crazy, but I think we found a new way for missiles to kill people. Not just that they can be lobbed at our enemies and smash them to bits, but also that the American workers that are helping to build and construct and maintain them will infect each other with the coronavirus as part of that process. It's kind of crazy. Marcus, you read this story. What are you telling us?
Well, missiles and guns and bullets don't kill the coronavirus. And let's just be very honest about priorities here. Capitalism on this level is hyper dangerous. We have a military-industrial complex that might be a little bit outdated and might need to understand that you need to have citizens in order for you to protect them. You need to have citizens to pay taxes in order for the government to give you contracts, right? Since y'all have to have people working, you have to have a military industrial complex system. I don't agree with that. I'm saying that sarcastically. But since they have to be around and we haven't seen the political will and the political wherewithal from anybody to actually speak about where our priorities are going, we're going to have to change up our tactics a little bit. And our major tactic needs to be protecting our workers. There needs to be a federal plan and reevaluation that the military industrial complex doesn't necessarily need to be employed right now when we already have ships, carriers. I mean, we're kicking captains off carriers for trying to protect their soldiers, and we're also keeping the employees of these military complex companies working and catching the coronavirus. My thought process is simple: when are we going to start caring about our folks and not just blind money that goes from Georgia to Florida to opening these beaches again to and in Georgia and Florida, yes, they just opened the beach. So I'm locked down here in Atlanta, but I can drive down to Tybee Island and catch the coronavirus.
Wait. You need to double down on that. You're telling me they've opened the beaches?
Yes. Look it up. Tybee Island here in the great state of Georgia has just opened up the beaches because, somehow fun in the sun stopped the coronavirus.
Do sunbathers have to be 6 feet apart?
I'm pretty sure they said something like that, but when in God's history have you ever seen people at the beach stand 6 feet apart? Get out of here.
Yeah. Wow. That's wild. Get my mind around that. The next story we have for you has to do with sort of the opposite of going out to the beach, and this is the mass incarceration under the cloud of coronavirus. Now, we've already covered in this show, and it's widely known that inmates, people that are incarcerated, whether it's a county jail or a federal prison, are especially susceptible to the spread of COVID-19. And they're especially constrained in terms of how they can address it. They can't go somewhere the ways in which incarcerated people move around the facility and so on, very hard to change these things in a radical way. What do we need to do to protect our relatives, our friends, our community members who are incarcerated right now? Marcus?
Well, I'm gonna let Steve go first, and then I'm gonna come back and follow up with him because I have a couple things to say.
And I'm gonna kick it back to you, Mark. So I want to hear what you have to say first, and then I'll follow up.
First, let's talk about legislature then, right? Listen, there's an article that about Governor Cuomo that came out saying because Governor Cuomo has brought a sense of stability to the general masses when it comes down to looking like a leader during these times. Problem is, Governor Cuomo also used the coronavirus and the epidemic and legislators trying to pass legislation to make sure that we end our policies of criminal justice reform in America. Just like any other industry, we must remember at all times that the private prison industry and the jail system and criminal justice across the nation is a company. It is a capitalistic company. And if you think about one of the first traded commodities in America, that was slavery. Now, I hate to make a correlation right here, but there's been a lot of talk about taking money away from these private prison industry corporations recently because of these criminal justice reforms. And they're like, wait a minute, pause. This is a grand opportunity for us to strengthen our coffers and make sure that our stock values go up. So what are they doing? They're taking state money, they're taking their state relationships, and they're making sure that criminal justice reform is backed away from right now. And they're earmarking it and putting it in the back of legislation that these states are passing right now to make sure that people get the relief that they need from the stimulus packages on a statewide level. They're using earmarks right now to reverse criminal justice reform. And at this point, if we're not looking at how we let people out of jail or how we use our prison systems instead and open up the gates and allow people to have space and change the complete tactics that they use from isolation to prison yards to forcing people to go outside to putting people in a cell next to each other, and then that person goes to a cell and then they go outside in the prison yard, and then after they go outside in the prison yard, they contact coronavirus and then they spread it to their cellmate. It's a bad system that's helping out no one.
Steve?
Yeah, well, I just want to speak a little bit to the for-profit aspects of this, just like a thought experiment for people watching, and that is that so 6% of America's prisons, I believe, are private prisons. But what's really important is that within the prison system itself is everything, like within, if you are a prisoner, everything is for profit in terms of if you want to make a phone call outside of the prison, you pay higher rates than a normal person would. Food is spiked up prices. And the thought experiment is in many jails in America, and increasingly so, under the banner of trying to end contraband like cell phones and drugs and stuff, that's sort of the pretext that's used. There's been this push by systems, jail systems and prison systems to basically create no visitor policy and video only. And so that's sort of, in a way, like people who are in America's prison system experienced a lot earlier, like what people are now kind of bemoaning, like, oh, we have to talk on video only, we can't really go visit our friends. Well, that's been the case for years now in prison. It's becoming increasingly so. So I just think that's important to point out. And these calls are extremely expensive. If you want to make like a 1 hour video call, and in some cases, like Securus would be the contract or the company, that could be like $25 for a single 1 hour call. And I've done reporting on this before I was at the Real News Network. I was working for Prison Legal News. So we did an entire survey of Washington State and all of their counties. And yeah, it's not just the video calls, it's also the phone calls. But this is just like the commodification of prisoners and sort of gouging money from prisoners is just a whole nother aspect of it that's been going. I think that's a big impetus for maybe why you want to keep the doors of the prisons shut for a lot of prisoners in the United States.
Absolutely. Well, our hearts go out to people who are behind bars at this time. Um, Moving on to our next story, we have an opposite situation here in opposite land where luxury resorts are facing a coronavirus crisis because one percenters are fleeing the cities to go to vacation resorts. And that just feels kind of bonkers that's what's going on. And I remember reading, I think it was last week, that all kinds of towns on Long Island were really upset that folks were coming in from Manhattan and taking all the goods out of the supermarket, buying stuff up, and really changing the demographics and economy of local towns that weren't expecting people until later in the season. Jocelyn, what can you tell us about this?
In a turn of events that's not shocking to anyone, it turns out that the super rich are fleeing for their summer homes. But the problem with that being, the most notorious example, we covered this on the Act Twitch show a while ago, is the elites of New York City heading for their summer homes in the Hamptons. The problem, of course, being the Hamptons is not suited in the best of times for a population swell of that magnitude. And people are forgetting half of the coronavirus prevention mechanism is not getting it. But the other half is ensuring you're near a hospital with the capacity to handle this crisis, which, of course, these smaller touristy areas don't have, right? So that is the two-part problem that we're dealing with this, is that the American healthcare system does not have the capacity to handle this. And so then you have these rich idiots going into areas with small hospitals, definitely not enough respirators to handle something like this. And the populations are swelling and they're being stupid and going to the beach. And it's very predictable, but it's also very unfortunate because I'm in Washington, D.C. I live right downtown, unfortunately. So I understand the impulse to flee for a remote area, but people are forgetting that's not really a solution that it might appear to be.
I was also thinking about the fact that early on it was recognized that elite jet setters are more likely to be carrying the disease, not to be affected as much, and then to spread it to local populations. So in a sense, if you're a vacation resort, the last thing in the world you want is for the wealthy resort goers to show up.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is true even not at the level of one percenters, but if you're an upper middle class professional, the reality is you just travel a lot more than a working class person who lives in a rural area, works a paycheck type job and hasn't left their city or town and however knows when. But you deal with a very specific type of professional or very wealthy person, and they travel constantly. So, of course, they're more likely to be exposed and then carry that. You know, there's been all these articles about, like, please resist the temptation to go to a small national park town and just, like, escape. Stay where you are. There's a reason the order is shelter in place and not flee the city, you know? We're supposed to, like, if you are in New York City, it's probably terrifying, but the reality is you are closer to hospitals, which are far better equipped to handle this than you are in rural summer town home, even if it is the Hamptons.
Even after 2 terms of Cuomo.
You tell me that you can't, that the coronavirus won't be stopped by $100 bill face masks?
No, I've heard that actually. That's scientific. Very
Steve,
unfortunate.
Steve, what were you going to tell us?
I think that there's a really interesting parallel to be seen with this and a lot of things with the coronavirus, but on this trend of elites trying to go somewhere else to escape the coronavirus or to escape being bored because maybe they're less stuck in place in the urban areas they would be in the rural periphery, if you will. I think that's probably the logic in a lot of people's heads is just, oh, maybe I'll have more open space where I can go walk around and hike and not be stuck in like the rest of the plebes. That's probably a lot of the calculation, but I think that speaks to what I want to say is it's a lot like climate change, right? Like climate impacts are already being felt and will increasingly be felt first and foremost by working class people and the poor across the world, on island states, on people who live close to shorelines that are where the sea level is rising, and the people who might live in those areas, they can build seawalls if they have more money, for example. They can go move somewhere else. And so I think the same thinking applies with the elites here, is they can just go somewhere else and avoid the hardships of having to stay in, or whatever the thinking is. They think they can use their money to get away from it. I think the most extreme example, just to close with my thought here, is Jeff Bezos, who's such a super villain in this whole story of his Amazon workers and the exploitation of them. On the issue of climate change, like, Jeff Bezos is plotting right now to build a new place where elites can go in outer space. He has a subsidiary company of Amazon that is aiming to do that. And that is, it sounds extreme, like I'm making that up, but you can look it up. Jeff Bezos has not only like imperialism of this whole planet in mind, he has imperialism of another planet in mind. Go ahead,
you're not saying the name Elon Musk, and that's confusing to me.
That's another example. Both, yeah.
Well, damn, it'll be harder to
hijacking that plane. I don't care. I'm getting up there if it all goes down.
I wish you luck, my friend. Well, now on to another section of elites. We're turning our attention to the fossil fuel industry, fracking, Saudi Arabia. And just to set this up, the entire fracking industry exists because the price of oil was so high. And it was so high that even the erratically inefficient method of pumping the earth full of one kind of poison in order to release the other kind of poison and then transport it long distances so that it can burn and put more CO2 out into the air. I mean, that whole thing seemed a little bit specious from the start. But now we're finding out that a Trump-tied law firm has actually been helping the Saudis try and destroy our fracking industry. Steve, I can't figure this out. Is this good news or bad news?
You know, it's kind of weird. It's kind of like an in-between news because, yeah, this firm, Brownstein, Hyatt, and Farber, and Schreck, of course, it kind of like there's like a dual loyalty almost to the Trump administration here, because he also has his own ties to the fracking industry. His energy advisor for his campaign in 2016, Harold Hamm, has actually been pushing him to punish Saudi Arabia, to maybe even sanction them, because Saudi Arabia is basically pumping the prices of oil down right now globally and I think there's been good analysis that says Saudi Arabia sees this as sort of their one chance to really fend off the rest of the world and sort of still be a supreme player in the oil industry, but is really hurting the fracking industry in the United States. This pre-existed coronavirus, but it's been made worse for this industry by coronavirus. And so there's a lot of companies that think they have to shut down in the United States, or at least very much do less drilling in the United States because they don't have the money right now. And airplanes aren't flying right now. We're seeing way less cars on the road. This crazy atmosphere that we're operating in. But yeah, in terms of like, who's the good guy here, who's the bad guy there, I think like the premise of the story is actually two very bad guys going at it right now. And that's the dynamic that we saw in the meeting on Friday. We saw Big Oil, which is like ExxonMobil and American Petroleum Institute. They were at the meeting, but so were the frackers. So like Harold Hamm, who I just mentioned before, Kelsey Warren, who's the owner of Energy Transfer Partners. He was at that meeting. And it's really a crazy meeting. We're talking about Trump met with the executives of some of the biggest oil and gas companies in the United States, sort of in the midst of a mass public health crisis. He brought them to the table and asked, what can I do for you? I think that sort of shows where his priorities are, and they're looking to pump billions of dollars potentially in subsidies, or potentially like with Saudi Arabia, they might do something like with the imports, they might put more of a tax on that oil to get it in the United States. So there's still a lot of options at play, but I think all of the options right now that are being weighed, to sum it up, by the Trump administration are very bad options when we're talking about the climate crisis, which would probably not be surprising to anyone watching.
It's interesting to note that recently the KXL, the Keystone pipeline, passed one of the regulatory hurdles that still existed. That pipeline exists to serve the fracking industry in a sense, if I'm not mistaken. Why would it make sense to simultaneously be, lying on your back prostrate because of Saudi lowering the price of oil, and then at the same time building an expensive pipeline to help transport fossil fuel that has no business being dug up in the first place.
I'll say something about that quickly. I think that that's a very important parallel. So talking about the barrier that you're talking about, I think it's not really so much for a regulatory barrier, but in Canada, the Alberta government gave billions of dollars. The Keystone XL have been mired for years. The climate movement has really put that front and center, the thing that they've been fighting against basically for the past decade. And with the price of oil plummeting, it's made extracting tar sands pretty much uneconomical. And the premier of Alberta basically came out and said, this thing would not go through unless we as a government gave it billions of dollars. So they're admitting that it wasn't profitable unless it got massive government subsidies. And I think that, so it's pretty easy that the Alberta government is conservative. It's kind of easy to point at them and say, oh, they're like they're the villain of the story. They're doing this. Of course, they're carrying the water to the fossil fuel industry. But what I found illuminating about the situation was the Trudeau government, which is, has this global image of progressiveness. They came out in support of it as well, not Trudeau, but his energy minister. So I think that we're seeing on both sides of the border efforts to prop up the fossil fuel industry in this unprecedented time of a global pandemic and with the coronavirus hitting, obviously, Canada, United States, and the whole world right now.
But still, to end this bit on a note of optimism, aren't you pleased at the low price of oil, the decline of the interest of the fossil fuel industry, just the fact that our skies are clear? It's almost as if the planet has decided to turn a new leaf.
And that's something, I'm glad you ended on that note, Charles. That's something I've been pointing out in our climate news roundups that I do every week for the Real News, is that is sort of, it's not a good silver lining, and that it's not really, obviously the economy being devastated and people not having jobs and all this devastation is horrific. But it's offered, the way I've been saying it in newsletters, it offers a lens through, like, what does a world look like that doesn't have all of this pollution? What does a world look like that doesn't have cars back to back in Los Angeles and smog in the air? What is like a lesser fossil fuel industry look like? And I think we're seeing like a possibility maybe of a more sustainable world. It can't be achieved in this way through a global pandemic, obviously, but I'm glad that you said that. And I think that that's something that those who follow climate change and something like the Green New Deal, this is definitely a teachable moment. That's what I've been saying in the weekly newsletters. Right.
Thank you for that. And we're going to turn now to, you had mentioned before, Steve, about the you were talking about Amazon and how Jeff Bezos is a kind of a made-for-television villain in this. He participated in his own villainy even more recently. An Amazon worker in Staten Island. He's from New Jersey. He was recently fired under really, really odd allegations that he had somehow endangered his fellow workers. But the truth of the matter is even stranger. So just to set up this clip from a story that was done by a reporter at the Real News, this young man is trying to organize his fellow workers in Amazon. He's part of an effort protected by our laws to organize a union at the Amazon facilities on Staten Island. And he was fired after being accused of endangering his fellow workers. And this conversation wasn't happening sort of at the level of the facility. This was happening with Jeff Bezos himself. And as we will see from this clip, the allegations against him are lies. And what this really is another instance of union busting by one of America's top companies. Start the clip, Dwayne.
Jeff Bezos, and stated Smalls is not smart or articulate. New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted that this showed Amazon was carrying out a racist and classist PR campaign. She said if execs are as concerned about worker health and safety as they claim, then they should provide the full paid sick leave all workers deserve. Amazon workers are among the ranks of those deemed essential, which means they are continuing to perform their jobs despite the risk of COVID-19. But many say their employers are endangering their lives by failing to protect them from this ongoing pandemic. Well, now joining us to respond to this leak and to discuss all of this is Chris Smalls himself. He was fired from Amazon, they say, for failing to socially distance. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
So we know this is, it's a crazy time for everybody, but especially for frontline workers like yourself, and especially for folks like yourself that sort of, risked it all. Just having a job right now is really important to people, and you risked it all to, fight for your fellow workers. So I wanted to start off by asking you to respond to this memo, that sort of laid out their plan to smear you, to sort of like undermine you, attack your sort of your reputation and what you stand for, saying you're not smart or articulate, like AOC says. That's racist, straight up racist too. Give us your response.
My response to that is thank you. You know why? We know what we're dealing with. Like you said, the entire world know exactly who these people are now. My response is thank you. Now we know what they want to do, but guess what? I'm not falling for the trap. This is not about Chris Smalls. Never was. This is about the people. Like you said, it's about the front line.
So, Jocelyn, what struck me was that what Chris is doing is asserting in a very serious way that he recognizes there's a class war. Jeff Bezos, his employer, is the enemy, along with the 1%, and he, as an individual, isn't really the point. It's really about the workers that he's working with, the function that they play, and their need to organize. What are you learning from this?
I mean, I think there's a lot of hope there, right? Because this is if we can actually build that class consciousness and use tragic moments like this one to coalesce a sense of workers' unity and dignity and collective energy, then I think that this could be a hopeful flashpoint. But it's a very difficult thing to do when people are kept in a frantic state of busyness and motion. And I think that's why what Amazon does and the way they treat their workers is so cruel, because if there's like a complete mental duress and an inability to just basically be with yourself, it makes it very difficult to continue working for either yourself or your company. But that's intentional. So I don't know.
Yeah, well, I expect to see more of Chris in the coming weeks and months as this campaign organizes. I want to give a shout out to anyone watching who is working for Amazon right now. We are following closely the labor efforts, the labor organizing efforts taking place at Amazon facilities around the country, as well as Amazon white-collar workers who are raising issues around the need to safeguard the climate and the environment as part of how Amazon does business. Y'all are a real inspiration. Thank you. I was going to ask, did you have anything to add on this, Marcus? Oh, nope. We lost Marcus. We're going to move on to our next story, which is about how the Wisconsin election was almost going to kill a lot of people, and then, well, maybe not. Steve?
So the Wisconsin situation is so crazy. So like full disclosure, I just want to say that I've lived in Wisconsin most of my life until a few years ago. So I've used to follow Wisconsin politics really closely. I haven't followed as closely in the Tony Evers era, but I was really following closely during the Scott Walker era, which preceded this. And a lot of the madness that was in place during the Walker era still exists because the GOP still has a lot of power, even though Walker is not the governor anymore and Evers took his place during the last election cycle, roundly defeating Walker finally after several attempts by the Democrats. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is a very interesting story because it showed sort of not only, so the GOP has just been steamrolling this forward within the legislature to say that we need to hold the elections, and a lot of it has to do with the Supreme Court seat that's up, and they want to have a bigger majority on the Supreme Court in Wisconsin. So that's their selfish motive there. On the Democratic side, though, until recently, There was lots of Democrats at a lower level who were saying we really need to suspend this thing. It's very dangerous. There's already been so many states before this that have, but Evers had been reluctant to do that. And people were sort of like wondering what's the deal with this. Even the state party had said we need to suspend this, but Evers was still going forward with this. And then late last week, he reversed course, called for a special session. The special session, which happened on Saturday, didn't really actually happen. There was like several seconds, and then the GOP just said, well, looks like we're having the election. So Evers came forward today and issued an emergency order, basically postponing the election until June. And the GOP is still hammering back. They're saying they want the Supreme Court to review this. So I think it's still actually technically up in the air. And I guess it's up to, I don't know if the Supreme Court will have time to review it before now and tomorrow or what the situation is, but it's not 100% definitive that Wisconsin won't be voting tomorrow. And the last thing I'll say is if there will be voting tomorrow, well, I'll just use Milwaukee as a case, since we were talking about Milwaukee a little bit earlier at the beginning of this show. Milwaukee is a place that, because of the coronavirus, originally the county had 180 polling sites. Now it has 5 polling sites. It is a county with 600,000 plus people, the biggest county in the state, and all of them will be shuttled into 5 polling sites. So you talk about social distancing, and that atmosphere is basically impossible. It's putting so many people at risk. And you look at the neighboring county, Waukesha County, there's 70,000 people in that county, 1 polling site. And if you didn't register to do mail-in or absentee ballot by April 3rd, that means you either are disenfranchised and can't vote tomorrow if you want to go and vote, or it means that you go and put your health at risk. So I'll be curious to see what the Supreme Court does. But as of now, at least the governor in Wisconsin, Tony Evers, has suspended the primary until June.
Wow. Marcus?
My brother Mandela Barnes is the lieutenant governor up there in Wisconsin. This goes back to race in America. I think race literally is one of the biggest fundamental issues. I served as Stacey Abrams' deputy campaign manager at one point in my career, and I will tell you that they stole the election down here in Georgia. Now, what does that have to do?
I'm going to give a moment. Marcus, you still with us? What I know is, yeah, he froze. Is he back? Okay. Marcus, I hope we can get you back in a minute, but not to continue his thought, but my thought was that you're talking about a Republican-approved voter suppression measure. The virus does an excellent job of making people feel afraid of going to vote, and especially if they belong to a marginalized community. And as we saw at the top of the show, African Americans are suffering way disproportionately from the effects of coronavirus. So it's almost like the Republicans want to use the disease in order to win an election. Am I getting that wrong, Steve?
And I think that you are getting it right. I think the one additional layer that I think is in here is that if you look at there's been stories about this, who is most concerned about coronavirus, like as a demographic. And it's really like a parallel to the voting map in the United States. So in blue areas, people are freaking out. They see this as a huge public health crisis. But in red areas, they see it as overblown. And a lot of it has to do with President Trump, right? He didn't take it seriously. Him and his followers at one point were calling it a hoax. And I think that because of that, they may be more willing to go to the polls, and they don't really think that it's as big of a risk as Democratic voters. So I very much think it's a voter suppression tactic. And I don't think the Milwaukee thing is just instructive because that has a very high population of African-American voters. And now there's only 5 polling sites. If it were to proceed tomorrow, only 5 polling sites in Milwaukee, and then neighboring Waukesha, 1 polling site. So, I mean, I think that all that stuff is in play.
It's crazy. Well, we're going to put a pleasant spin on the end of our show. We're going to our fun section, as we always do. And first up, we have Larry David. telling us what to do during this very special time.
Hello, I'm Larry David. Obviously, somebody put me up to this because it's generally not the kind of thing I do, but I basically want to address the idiots out there, and you know who you are. You're going out, I don't know what you're doing, you're socializing too close, it's not good. You're hurting old people like me. Well, not me, I have nothing to do with you, I'll never see you, but let's say other old people who might be your relatives, who the hell knows. But the problem is you're passing up a fantastic opportunity, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to stay in the house, sit on the couch, and watch TV. I mean, I don't know how you're passing that up. Well, maybe because you're not that bright. But here it is. Go home, watch TV. That's my advice to you. If you've seen my show, nothing good ever happens going out of the house. You know that. There's just trouble out there. It's not a good place to be. So stay home and don't see anyone, except maybe if there's a plumbing emergency, let the plumber in and then, wipe everything down after he leaves. But that's it.
I feel like don't see anyone is the call of all of Larry David's exes. What are you thinking about this, Jocelyn?
It's good advice. And I think Larry David is the right messenger for it. I think a little bit of we should all be trying to access our inner misanthrope right now. Unfortunately, I don't have one, so I'm trying to create one, but doing the best I can. How about you? I know that you have an inner misanthrope, Charles.
Well, I confess, a time when everyone has to be socially distant, being an introvert, and loving humanity more than the individual people inside of it. It really is a glorious time for a sliver of the population that I'm confident Larry David is part of that sliver. All right, and now Steve, another story from your state. This is about Jane Fonda, and I know that basically most people watching this show understand and know that Jane Fonda made those workout videos in the 80s, and it was a big deal at the time. Less well known is that she did that in order to raise money for progressive causes and elections, together with her then husband, Tom Hayden. Steve, can you tell us about how Jane Fonda is resurrecting home workouts to fight climate change?
Yeah, well, yeah, she's brought it back. I mean, it's been decades, and she's been doing a lot of other stuff since then. But her activism has continued, and she's been doing these every Friday, these Fire Drill Fridays, where they were before COVID broke out. Originally in Washington, D.C. every week, and it's moved to Los Angeles because she is continuing to film Grace and Frankie for Netflix. So it moved to LA over the recent months. But she's been doing these. Now it's basically something that she can't do, and so she's brought the fitness show online, so people can still get a taste of Jane Fonda, and also become aware of the climate crisis, which has become one of her biggest causes in the past year or so.
Marcus, will you be my stay-at-home workout buddy?
I've been trying to get some push-ups in, man. But if I haven't done it in a while, and if I start coughing, I immediately start getting concerned. So therefore, we have a double-edged sword here.
Fair enough. All right, and I hate to do this, but our last story before we close the show, and I'm glad, Marcus, you're able to come back to see this out. We're talking about sidewalk etiquette in the time of COVID-19. Who wants to tell us what we need to know about interacting with other folks? And before we go into that, I am hearing a lot of complaints, especially from my Brooklyn friends who are telling me how many people they experience in Prospect Park or wherever who seem to not understand how far 6 feet is. What else do we need to know?
I feel like a white lady in the 90s avoiding the big black guy now because I walk in the middle of the street. I swear to God, I just walk in the middle of the street. I don't even walk on the sidewalk anymore. I just walk in the middle of the street acting like they're trying to steal my purse.
That must be a new experience for you, Marcus.
Yes, it is.
So it looks like COVID-19 is here to teach Americans of all stripes how to have more empathy to other fellow Americans with radically different life circumstances. I want to thank our wonderful hosts and co-hosts. We had Marcus Ferrell, political consultant. We have Jocelyn Keatts, who is a Twitch streamer with Act TV, our friends, and Steve Horn, our climate reporter based in San Diego. Thank you all so much for being with us for Stir Crazy.